Good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. Can you hear me? Great, good. My name is Marita Hines. I'm the Director of Education here at the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture. I'm from Tesuque Pueblo, and I want to welcome you to today's Native Narrative Speaker Series. This is the 8th in our event that we're having here, and the series of panel discussions, programs, presentations are all a part of the Here, Now, and Always exhibit. The exhibit has 7 areas of concentration: cycles, ancestors, home and community, trade and exchange, language and song, survival and resilience, and art. Each of the Native Narrative Speaker Series are connected to these areas. I want to acknowledge and thank Edward and Maria Gale and the Gale Family Foundation for generously supporting this event and this series. First of all, I want to thank Regis, Alvin, Brian, and Matthew for being here today. We are very fortunate to have this incredible group of gentlemen here. Today, I'd like to introduce Matthew Martinez, who is our moderator today. He will introduce our guest panel, and towards the end, Matthew will open it up for Q&A. Matthew Martinez received his PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota in 2008. He has worked researching and producing documentary films detailing Pueblo traditions and histories. Previously, he was the deputy director of the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture and served as first lieutenant governor of Okayewinge. Currently, Matthew is the executive director of Mesa Puerta Petroglyph Project, a nonprofit in northern New Mexico dedicated to protection of cultural resources and land stewardship. Please welcome Matthew Martinez.
Thank you, Marita. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for such an important topic, thinking about government and leadership and governance. And so I'm really honored to be here with my good friends that I've known throughout the years that have influenced my work, have influenced each other's and many other tribal nations across the state. I think about this story. Growing up, I was probably 6 or 7 years old, and I recall very vividly a knock on our family house, on our door, and these leaders from my tribe came and got my father on January 1st. And he, went to be on his way in the community there and came back a couple hours later with the staff in his hand. And again, I just clearly see this as a movie in my mind playing out, what that meant for him to come into our house with this item, this energy, this spirit, this ancestor. And we gathered and we fed the cane. And soon after, we were busy cleaning house, chopping wood, doing yard work, and everything that comes to how we think about preparation for these celebrations. And so in 2017 and 2018, I was appointed as first lieutenant governor, and my son, who was 6 or 7 years old at that time, was also part of those activities. And so it's come full circle, and that's really the spirit of the work that we do in our communities and as leaders. And so what's next for future generations, your grandkids, everybody that's going to be following and all the work that we do. I always like to talk about honoring, and last year we said goodbye to our head councilman, Joe Garcia, so it'll be a year of since his passing. There's 2 quotes that I pulled just from the work that I've been doing with him, and one is, the relationship between tribes and the federal government is eternal. So long as there is a constitution that begins with "we the people," we must work together for our mutual benefit. It's our culture, our language, and our ways that give us strength. Being diverse is important. It's a profound strength. You have powerful gifts. your mind and spirit. You can choose what you will do with these gifts. Joe Garcia, Sahua Winkta. I'm going to introduce our panel, starting with my left. Brian Vio is a member of the Pueblo of Acoma with 30 years experience working in areas of museum development, cultural resource management, historic preservation, and tourism. He has dedicated his career to promoting Native American arts and culture, as well as advocating for the protection of sacred sites, repatriation of ancestors, and items of cultural patrimony held in museums and private, federal, and state institutions. A self-taught painter, Brian is inspired by his culture and the landscape of Acoma, which influenced his multimedia paintings. He served as governor of Acoma from 2019 to 2021. Regis Pecos is the former governor of Cochiti Pueblo and served on the traditional council for 35 years. He received his undergraduate degree from Princeton University and his graduate degree from UC Berkeley. He's also a graduate of the Senior Government Executive Program at the John F. Kennedy School of Harvard. Regis was the longest-serving chief executive of the New Mexico Office of Indian Affairs, a position he held for 16 years. He has taught each summer for the last 14 years in the Junior Policy Institute at the School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton University, and is a trustee emeritus of Princeton. He's a chair of the prestigious Board of Governors for the Honoring Nations program at the John F. Kennedy School at Harvard. He has also been an adjunct professor in the School of Public Administration at the University of New Mexico. He is a co-founder and co-director of the Leadership Institute, an indigenous think tank based in Santa Fe, at the campus of the Santa Fe Indian School, now in its 24th year. To my far left is Alvin Warren. Alvin is a member of the Santa Clara Pueblo, where he lives with his wife Pamela and his Leto Pueblo tribal member and their children. He's a longtime farmer and involved in his Pueblo's cultural life. He's also served in various capacities during his career. This includes Vice President of Career Pathways and Advocacy for the Llano Foundation, former Cabinet Secretary of Indian Affairs for the state of New Mexico, Lieutenant Governor of Santa Clara Pueblo, Program Officer for the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and National Tribal Lands Program Director for the Trust for Public Lands. So with that, thank you all for being here. I have to navigate between my, I turned 50 this year, and these came with my birthday gift, so it's, so bear with me. Oh, God. I want to start off with the question for Regis and turn this over to you to really just open the conversation up and provide some context. Our tribal sovereignty extends beyond millennia and has shaped how we think about governance. And core values become central to guiding these entities, these forces, these spirits, but also the historic arc and federal policy that we'll get to later too. Regis, can you talk about some of the context and core values that really shape how we got here today?
Dr. Martinez, you start with an easy question. Huh? Let me first say and one, express what an honor it is to share this panel with these two gentlemen that I have the greatest respect for. In response to this question, it's a really essential one to respond to because it is related to what the elders teach us with regard to how core values, as defined, I'll share with you, really is what nourishes the spirit of sovereignty. And our elders teach us that sovereignty is at the heart of our existence. And sovereignty is a living spirit. And the ultimate birth of this spirit comes from our Creator, with the Creator's breath to this spirit that is at the heart of our existence, that is the right to exist. And at the time of emergence for Pueblo people, our elders teach us that at that time of emergence, the Creator gifted to our ancestors at the time all that would be required to sustain a healthy mind, body, and spirit. And these are defined by our core values. And the Creator, in gifting these core values, our elders teach us, is a prescription of how to live. And so I should recognize that in the founding of the Leadership Institute, driven by the need for looking at new spaces and new ways to transfer this knowledge from time immemorial. And your father, Dr. Dave Warren, among other cultural leaders who helped to conceive the Leadership Institute, helped us to conceive how best to create this visualization of the relationships of what is at the heart of our existence. And so in that creation of, if you will, try to visualize 3 critical circles, all interrelated. One cannot exist without the other. And so in this first circle is what we call the gifts of the Creator. And one of those gifts contained in that circle is language. The spirit of language, which is the means by which we find purpose and existence of our role in this larger universe. A way of life is also that gift. Governance is also part of that gift. And a complement to that are the gifts of our indigenous customary laws and values used in the governance process that defines how we relate with one another and with all living things that are also the gift for our sustenance. And so in that circle also is family, which is the receiver of the most precious gift that humanity might continue. And supporting family in receiving the precious gift of children is the larger community that obligates itself to nurture the gift of children and what and how they ultimately become the stewards and the guardians of our respective communities. Also important in that circle of gifts are all of the resources that are part of the larger ecosystem that one provides the sustenance for the maintenance of a healthy mind, body, and spirit. And then water as the ultimate gift in that circle that is the giver of all life, necessary for the existence of all life. The next circle, if you will, are the circle that we refer to as core values. And this is at the heart of your question, Dr. Martinez. And the core values as gifted to us from every generation since that time of emergence is love for one another, respect for one another, compassion for one another, understanding for one another, humility, integrity, faith, all that represent how they contribute to bring life in guiding our relationships. And in all of our convenings, we ask our participants, what is a core value that defines who you are? What you do and why you do what you do. And as they share many more in this circle of core values, we ask, who gifted you that core value? And always it's going to be mom, dad, grandpa, grandma, some significant member of the community. And our elders teach us that these gifts of core values is the deepest expression of love of people who gift this to us to guide us through our life journey. And how we use those core values to live each day along our life journey that begins in the morning with prayer, and in the evening, a reflection of how well we've lived each day. And as we live, our elders teach us by core values, we will always make the right decision because they teach that core values will never lie to you. Core values is a conscious way of living. And so as we live life guided by our core values as best as we can, it is how we honor those who gifted us the core value. And ultimately, when we have children, that is what we gift to them, grandchildren, with all of the hopes and faith that as they live by the core values, it defines what kind of caretakers they become in life. Will they be loving, respectful, and compassionate? That is up to us in what we give them to guide their lives. And that is central to the core values, because then the next circle, connected to core values and the gifts of the Creator, is where faith is a deep connection. Prayer as a gift for the maintenance of that spirituality is reinforced in this kind of continuous movement from one season of birth, of rebirth, as we use seasons like the spring for cleaning the waterways of the sacred serpent, cleaning the fields for replanting, nurturing them in that cycle, harvesting what sustains us physically and spiritually, and ultimately life goes back into hibernation, and then rebirth starts the cycle all over again. And so it's a daily. Our elders teach us that our way of life is not something we do 1 hour each day or 1 day out of the week. It is a continuous, engaged, conscious living. So that cycle of ceremonial cycle and process where prayer and faith is central, it's connected to the core values. The core values is what gives life to our relationship and connections to the gifts of the Creator. So in this case, the answer to the question with regard to the role of the core values, I'll sum up this way, is that the elders teach us that as long as we live by the core values gifted to us, that one is a reflective of a prescribed way of life that is the deepest expression of love in what we do, how we do in our relationship, that is the deepest, highest respect in the maintenance of healthy relationships. That is really central because the elders teach us that when language ceases to exist, culture dies. And when culture dies, the elders teach us that's the end of us. And if sovereignty is at the heart of our existence, and sovereignty is a living spirit, and the core values are all of the ingredients gifted to us to nourish all of the gifts of the Creator, deepened by our sense of faith and prayer and engagement. The governance of our communities are all complemented in ways that for us to have gone through the experience of being called to serve our people, it is that same Creator's breath of life that gave spirit to our responsibility for the people gifted to us to be our children, and included in those human beings that we must care for with love and respect and compassion are all other living things that are the complement to sustain us. And then ultimately, our elders teach us, if we abide by life accordingly, driven and gifted by our core values, then we shall never perish. But when we deviate from our core values is the beginnings of imbalance. And the farther we deviate from the core values, the more difficult it will be to maintain the governance of people and all relations in this way. So that is really the best way that I can help to articulate what was the gift at the time of emergence. What is incredibly profound is that in our oral societies, that every generation that has gone before us has defined our inheritance by word of mouth. That is how we have embraced that knowledge. And that is an incredible contribution to the resilience and the perseverance that allows us to be here to share that knowledge that is at the heart of our continuance in that journey that began at the time of emergence. And it's profound that all this would continue by word of mouth. Thank you.
I like how you reference this notion of breath. That's a really core element. And so I'm thinking, Hakandi, we refer to that as our teachers at home, but it's really Ha and Kangi is the bringing of breath, the bringing of that life and energy. And that's how we refer to as teachers. And so it makes sense to think about the larger intersections of how this comes together with that one simple act of breath. Thank you for that, Regis. I could listen to you for a long time, and I'm sure we all can. And what a privilege to hear and be reminded of these circles and these stories. In thinking about Government 101, this is obviously not textbook government, but it's important to understand U.S. policy and how things have been shaped over time. 2024 is a critical year because 100 years ago was a passage of the Indian Citizenship Act, recognizing American Indians as citizens, not giving them the right to vote until 1948 here in New Mexico, but recognizing them as citizens, despite being participants in World War I before, right? So there's this patchwork of federal policy that has really shaped this larger arc here. And so I want to follow up with Brian on a question, thinking about sovereignty as a spirit. How might have you seen some of this enacted in your own work, whether as a tribal leader and the work that you do in museums regarding repatriation? How does this living spirit come to play with policies and legislations? Where have you seen those crossroads, so to speak?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Martinez and Regis. I echo Dr. Martinez's comment that I could listen to all day. And so privileged to be here with both of you, Elvin and Regis. And thank you all for sharing your afternoon or your day with us. That's a loaded question. It's meant to be. And it's loaded because it's so complex. And the history of our governments and exercise and really the acknowledgement of our sovereignty goes so far back. As Regis indicated, sovereignty itself is this spirit. It's this energy and it's this power. And I think about our ancestors and our elders and their great respect for sovereignty and the ways in which they exercised sovereignty in probably some of the most difficult times of their lives, just trying to survive, trying to understand their place as they were on migration from the place of emergence, and making some very critical decisions along that migration to ensure that we could be here today. So that sacredness or that spirit of sovereignty is quite powerful. In 1991, December 28th or 29th, 1991, I was home on break for winter break from New Mexico State University. And I was quite young and careless and still trying to understand what my place was in this world. And for the first time in my life had left the reservation to experience life off the reservation and away from family and community. And so I was home, but I was in Albuquerque with some family, and I received a call early that morning from my father, and he asked me in Acoma, in our language, "Where are you? And you need to come home." And then the first thing that came to mind was, oh gosh, Dad got appointed again as something, So I said, okay, I will be home, and I asked him, what did they appoint you as? What position? And he said, well, explain when you get here. So I jumped in my truck and drove to Acoma, and when I arrived at my parents' house, there were a lot of cars outside, and I said, gosh, I hope nothing bad happened, And so I walked into my parents' home, and my mom walked up to me and embraced me, and she had tears in her eyes and said to me in our language that you will do a great job. I had no idea what she was referring to. And then the eldest of our uncles from my clan, who was also present, tells me in his very, as always, stern voice in Acoma, "Aishtu chakuya," sit down, take a seat. And he told me that I had been appointed to serve as a tribal secretary. So I listened to his advice as well as the advice of other family members. And one of the things that was so profound that my uncle told me in my first response was, I can't do this. I don't know how to be a tribal official. I can't do this. And why would they even pick me? And he tells me, look around in this room. He said, you will go and do this and accept this on their behalf and on our behalf of our community. And you will know how to do it. So with that, I made my way to the old Acoma, and even to this day, I don't recall driving from my mom's to Acoma. And I asked my uncle and my father if they were going to accompany me, and they said, no, you can do this, but your other uncles who are there at the meeting house where the men had gathered that day to participate in the appointment process. And so that's when it all began. And when I walked into the house at Acoma, one of my aunts was there, and she told me to eat, and she didn't know that I had been appointed. And she says to me, "Well, you're awfully late. You should have been here early this morning." And I said, "Oh, yes, I just came from Albuquerque, but I'm going to make my way over to the meeting house." And she says, "Okay." And she tells me, "Well, who knows how long you all are going to be in there, but the food will be ready when you get home." And I didn't say anything to her about the appointment, so I went to the meeting house and went through the process. I become the tribal secretary. And the governor at the time, the late Reginald Pasquale, when I accepted the position and was clothed spiritually with the being of the leader, and he leans over, calls me over and leans in and says, "I need you to do this." And he just put these tasks on my plate right then and there. And I wasn't even sure how to make sense of what he asked of me. And I think I was still shaking for a good half hour after everything was done. But one of the things that also Governor Pasquale said or shared with us that night, when all of the men had accepted their positions, were given the canes of authority, and before we all exited the meeting house, was, "We have to exercise our sovereignty." And I didn't know what that meant either at that time. And when I got home, by then all of the family had come to Acoma and were waiting at the house where my aunt had been alone that morning. And the advice that I was given by my clan uncles and others was what Regis just talked about, that handoff, that messaging, those reminders and advice, and quite sternly, advice about how this role is so important to not necessarily our family, but to the community, and to recall former leaders, some who are from our family, but former leaders and ancestors who fought so hard and did so much to get us to where we were at that time. One of the things that had just happened was the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act was transitioning to the Native American Free Exercise of Religion Act, I think it was. And Governor Pasquale, one of the tasks he mentioned that night to me was that we needed to prepare for some testimonial that he was going to provide on that, the proposed revision to the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And the first thought came to my mind was, why the heck do is there a policy so that we can exercise our religion and be who we are? Like, why does the federal government need to say this is okay? So I had to study this law, this policy, and also NAGPRA, as well as others. But I was also interested to know, well, if these federal laws exist, what exists here in our own tribal government system, within our own tribal law and order code? And how does the oral knowledge, the core values, the cultural pieces intersect with these policies? So there was a lot that was going through my mind really that first year, and of course, then fast forwarding 27 years later, I'm appointed as governor. And my father had also served as governor 4 different years. And he was and remains my best friend and teacher. But I felt like coming into this position as governor that I had some level of preparedness. But it became very evident that the issues were so much more complex. And that those policies that were born during that first appointment really didn't do what they were intended to do. And that the federal government had not lived up to its obligations as well, where these laws were concerned. But I also saw that in our own governance system and our own law and order code, that we now had policies in place around these issues as well. That the cultural values, the traditional governance concepts were now on paper. And the work as governor begins on day one. And just like that experience I had with Governor Pasquale, him leaning over telling me I had to do these things that night, to be thinking about it, was very similar on the first day of being governor. Was, here you go. Here are the pending issues, here, all of these things, and it was just so overwhelming and amazing at the same time. But I will have to say that the first year of being governor was really enlightening, because I saw that the tribe, my community, had made some advances in some very profound ways around policy, economic activity, education, and certainly where protection of cultural resources were concerned. And even while we had made some progress, it was very clear that there were a lot of forces that were working against us. And there was still so much work to be done. And I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to work with other governors from the other pueblos on these issues, these critical issues, to really lobby Congress and the state government, and even local governments on issues that were of great importance to our community. So that's really amazing that this energy of sovereignty informs us as leaders, really guides us as leaders on how we approach the day-to-day, but also these bigger issues. And also do the work of thinking about the future and securing a future for our people, just as our ancestors did for us. The pandemic, I served as governor during the pandemic, and of course, everything seemed to be put on hold. And it didn't really give us the time to do more of the work that my administration and our tribal council had hoped. But sovereignty played out in a different way during the pandemic. It was clearly focused on what can we do to protect our people. And so concentration was placed on the people, the safety of our people. Doing what we need to do from that core values and cultural standpoint also, and understanding to help settle the virus. So we were exercising our sovereignty, I think, in a different way. Where internally, we were in deep dialogue and discussion with cultural leaders. Everything else that may have been a critical issue or associated with policy on the federal and even state levels, we're kind of just waiting and placed on hold. But we realized that we had to continue to harness resources and maintain our place as a sovereign nation so that we could fulfill that very big responsibility to protect the people. And some of you might know that during the peak of the pandemic, the federal government decided that they would close our hospital. And we found ourselves in a position of fighting for our right to resources, and that there was way too much at stake in that peak of the pandemic to allow the federal government to do what they intended to do. That was a profound learning moment for all of us in our community. And I hope that experience and that acknowledgement that we exercised sovereignty in a way that ensured our people would be okay, and that when the virus settled, that we could re-engage in a stronger position, that would be the outcome. So I went like in this big circle, Dr. Martinez, but I see that the way in which sovereignty, tribal sovereignty, is playing out at the national level, there is always, it is a fight. It is a constant fight. And when you think about indigenous peoples throughout the world, they are in similar situations. Some in much more difficult situations than we are here in the United States. But it's that perseverance, the values, the core values that keep us in this, not only the fight, but allows us to fulfill our inherent responsibilities to care for the people, land, and resources. And I really am grateful also that individuals from our communities are embracing their sovereign right to become educated, to be leaders outside of our communities, putting their names on ballots, whether it be for tribal government office, state, federal leaders, and in other capacities. And many of those individuals are women from our communities. So this spirit of sovereignty is this tremendous gift to us. And I hope that it's seen and respected as such by the public, as we move forward. In that way, that it's not tribal leaders pounding on tables and demanding things, but it's the people's effort, our people's efforts to maintain a good life for ourselves and for future generations.
Thank you, Brian, for that. Personal experience growing up, I didn't realize it was 27 years the first time you served, and then stepping into governor, and just within that short amount of time, the amount of changes that you witnessed, right? It's pretty important to think about that perspective. I want to ask Alvin the next question, and thinking about what we've covered thus far, this notions of core values, the exercise of sovereignty, the spirit that has been guiding the decisions, the attacks on sovereignty. We're not trained as tribal leaders with the manual, right? You obviously got your directive from day one. What does service look like when it comes to stepping into these positions? How is service in tribal communities different from those that have been elected in federal offices, state offices? Maybe take some time to unpack this term of what service means from your own perspective, and have a story to share along those lines.
Well, umbiagandu, unsangiti. Good afternoon, everybody. Well, I think we kind of heard it in Brian's story. I think that's a beautiful example of what service looks like in our communities. I was thinking the theme, I think, of this, the eighth, I guess, of these series is around survival and resilience, I think. And as I've been listening to my brothers speak up here, it's reminded me that the four of us sitting here and our brothers and sisters who are in the audience was actually not intended to be. My father, Dave Warren, was mentioned by Regis, and we're blessed that he celebrated his 92nd birthday yesterday. Maybe some of you know him in the audience. And one of the privileges I had growing up with him was he was born in 1932, and he grew up in, speaking of policy, in what was known as the termination era for many tribes. And it's where the political status of many tribes in our country was ended. And essentially, they sort of ceased to be sovereign, or at least externally recognized sovereign entities, as yet another attempt by the United States government to invisibilize and assimilate, essentially make us disappear. And it's just the most recent act of many attempts to make us disappear, the first of which were much more brutal and very much not metaphorically disappear, but to actually not be present as a people. And my father would always remind me that he was always in awe of what was happening in our tribal communities, because he said this could have never been predicted. With so many of the things that he experienced growing up, to see the resurgence of the practical application of sovereignty, as former Governor Vio talked about, to have someone as incredibly eloquent as Regis be able to articulate our core values and how those translate not just as a historical concept, but as the fundamental way that living, breathing communities in our state continue to function in 2024, was almost unfathomable to my father. And I'm glad that I grew up with that, because it has kept me from, in some cases, taking for granted that it is the very act of individuals in our communities on a daily basis breathing life into our sovereignty that keeps that alive, that keeps our communities and our nations thriving. And I want to recognize, you might have noticed we're all men. To me, the society we live within in the United States thinks very much in terms of rights. And when Regis talks about core values, one of the fundamental core values for us as Pueblo people is responsibility. And responsibility, to me, the essence of responsibility begins with the mothers in our community. The approach of a mother to her child is not one of, it is my right to make you do this or to make you do that. It is, I have been gifted with you, and it is my profound responsibility to care for you. To me, that is the essence of service. That's where service literally is born in our community and reborn. And I think fathers also then have a similar responsibility to our children. And if you think about the way we're instructed as leaders, it isn't go forth and command. It is now everything is your children. The mountains, the plants, the animals, and the people are your children. Care for them. That's the core of the instruction. And it is such a different way to think about leadership, especially now in the bizarre politics that we live in. Can you imagine if the motivation of individuals seeking public office was to be good parents? So I want to recognize that that's where service to me begins. That's where responsibility begins. But I think part of the genius of Pueblo peoples and Pueblo communities is how we replicate this over time. And my story is going to have a couple of similarities, but some pretty stark differences to what you've heard from Brian. And I think it's a good illustration of the genius of our ancestors in how they have nurtured our societies. Because my path has been a very unexpected and unlikely one. I really shouldn't be sitting at this table with these gentlemen here. So I grew up here in Santa Fe, a short bike ride away up on Gonzales Road. My father is from Santa Clara, Pueblo. My mother is from Brazil, a Brazilian immigrant, no less. So imagine that, being both indigenous and first generation all at once. It was so much fun growing up. Growing up, I spent much more time, playing soccer with my friends, or having summer jobs and playing Miss Pac-Man at the hamburger place downtown. And we would go to Santa Clara for certain things, and I was, I don't know if I would say I was reverent as a child. I don't know if you've learned exactly that. But I wasn't closely connected to Santa Clara. I'll be very honest with you. But I was raised with our core values by my father, and I was very fortunate that my grandmother, his mother, came to live with us when I was in about, I guess, junior high. And she and I actually became very close. I certainly wasn't raised speaking the Tewa language. My father wasn't either. His parents were from two different tribes, so they didn't share a language, so he was raised speaking English. And of course, my mother's, from Brazil. So I go to Santa Fe High School, I graduate, I get into Dartmouth College, which, I was one of four from Santa Fe High School, graduating class of 500 and something, to go to an East Coast school. Two of them never came back. That sounds ominous, doesn't it? But they're fine, they're okay, but they just never came back to New Mexico.
Sounds like boarding school.
It sounds like boarding school, right. The other one, just for a handful of people, this will be interesting. Dave Thompson, does anybody know David Thompson on the Supreme Court? He's the other one. So we're the only two that came back from that graduating class. But go to an Ivy League school, like that's what society wants you to do. That's success, right? And most of the people I went to school with were on a different path. I was kind of like Brian. I had no idea what path I was on. But when the first choice came up, which I now see as the most pivotal of the first choices I had as an individual, to really demonstrate what are my values and how do, not only who gifted these values, but how are they meaningful to my life? When I was a junior, I went back to school, and it was a fairly difficult return because my grandmother had just passed away between my sophomore and junior years. And I was very, you can imagine how disorienting that is if someone so close to you has passed, and then to go very far away. And out of nowhere, I was offered what became the first year of something called the Mellon, was then called the Mellon Minority Academic Career Fellowship Program. Because in philanthropy, you get paid more by how many words you use. I work in philanthropy, so I can criticize philanthropy. So, but the fundamental purpose of the fellowship was to give resources to an individual to do research, in-depth research, and then to produce a thesis. Well, I was quite far away, so I could have probably just come up with something interesting to me and plowed ahead. But something sort of awakened in me, and I sort of left out that at the end of high school, I returned to the Pueblo, and I started taking part in our dances, and kind of began my process of being reconnected. So when I got that opportunity, I said I felt a really important or kind of compelling need to go back home and to ask what's needed. So I came back, and at that time we had a governor who's no longer alive named Calvin Tafoya. He didn't know me, and I went into his office and just respectfully said, "This is who I am. I have this opportunity to do some research. What does the Pueblo need?" I always think about that moment, because if these two gentlemen have been governors, I've been a lieutenant governor, there are many, many more important things happening in your day than to entertain a young man who you have never met before and engage in a discussion about research. But Calvin said, well, we're actually at a pivotal point for our land claims efforts, for our efforts to regain our traditional lands. Why don't you research that? And it was that basic. Well, at that time, that was all I needed. And I went back, and 2 years later, after a ton of research, produced a 200 and some page bachelor's thesis. And then I came back home, and I gave it to the tribal council, and I said, here, this is what you all asked me to do. Thanks for the opportunity. And the tribal council said, oh, not so fast. We'd like you to start a program here to get some of this land back. I was very much like Brian. I was like, you've got to be kidding me. I didn't, I know, you can run down the list. I didn't grow up here. I don't really speak the language, and I definitely don't know anything about getting land back. And why would you want me to do this in the first place? Well, that's all in your head. You're not actually going to say that out loud to anybody. And so that opened a door that then eventually led to the most significant restoration of land to Santa Clara in a century. And let me not pretend that it's me. It was what became an astounding array of people who just all were waiting for the right moment to not only believe that it was possible, but to then collectively act. I just happened to be around and be able to help with part of it. So already things are so unbelievable for this, young man who grew up here in Santa Fe, which might as well be, a million miles away from Santa Clara Pueblo. But what's at play is my community and my society calling me back. Sorry. We're blessed to have the opportunity to give back to our communities. And my story is not everybody's story. Unfortunately, you will find, and thank goodness for Regis and for things like the Leadership Institute, that help to create pathways back for our young people, because not all our young people find their way back. Many want to give back, and they don't. They maybe don't have the opportunities that were given to me to reattach their skills and their passions with what's needed by the community. But I was fortunate to have that. And then at age 24, so we have a slightly different governance system, which would take a whole other talk to explain. But Santa Clara was the first of the pueblos to adopt a written constitution. And let me make no mistake, there are some that would say that was progress. The fact that the majority of pueblos are still traditional theocracies that appoint their leaders, that is what's important. Santa Clara faced some pretty significant challenges through colonization that ended up fracturing our community, intentionally fracturing our community. And we found that, or our ancestors found that adopting a constitution was the only way to keep the community together and functional. But it became an interesting hybrid because there are 4 groups that can put forth an individual to run for the offices like governor and lieutenant governor or secretary. But in the case of the group that I belong to, no one ever volunteers. It is the traditional leadership that say, we think you should run for this, we think you should run for that. And so here I am, and at first when I was 23, our religious leaders said, we want you to run for this position. I was very much like Brian, but maybe even more so, because why in the world would you ever ask somebody who didn't grow up here to be in any leadership role? Fortunately, I was saved by the fine print, because you couldn't be elected to office until you were 25. So I could sort of sheepishly point to the document and say, actually, I can't do this. Not because I don't want to, but and they just sort of gave me that look like, we know you're not going anywhere. And then at age 25, I didn't have that excuse anymore, and I was asked to run for tribal treasurer, I think was the position they asked me to run for. And I was baffled that I almost won. Really, honestly, just baffled. And so it's in our hybrid system, you have 6 elected officials and then 8 that are appointed to the tribal council. So I didn't get elected, but our religious leaders said, oh, the people seem to think something of you, so you're going to be on the council now. So at age 25, I was sitting in the tribal council chambers as a tribal councilman. I spent 6 months of that year like this. I can't even remember the emotions. a part of me was a bit ashamed and certainly self-conscious, but I also felt like they have that picture, what in this picture doesn't belong? Like I was the thing that didn't belong in that picture. And about halfway through the year, I forget, there was some sort of a subcommittee getting appointed for something, and the governor asked me if I would be on it, and I said in some sort of low tone, there's probably somebody who's better, been here longer, And I was basically talking my way out of it. And one of the elder councilmen sternly said, "You're here for a reason. Do what you're here to do." And at that point, I said, "Okay." Which I think is another key piece of service in our communities. And I would go so far as to say that it is one of the important values of good leaders in our community is certainly humility, but humility may be bordering on a bit of self-doubt. I think that makes for some of the best leaders that we experience, because it means that one of the other things we're instructed is never think of yourself as more than than your children. You're here in service of your children. Along with the admonition that, remember, this job is temporary. And you will be returned to your community, and they will remember how you treated them. And in a small community, that's saying a lot, right? But I think this is how, Dr. Martinez, to your question, this is how service lives in our community. This is how responsibility is nurtured within individuals in our community. And to be a little drastic, even in somebody who grew up far away from our communities, we have a way to bring our people in and to find within individuals their individual ways to breathe life and breath into our sovereignty. And it certainly is in individuals who happen to have been in these more recognized offices. But it's also in the individuals who showed up this morning to paint our kiva. It's in what mothers do every day. It's in everything, the little and the big things that keep us alive as communities.
Dr. Martinez,
Yeah,
if I
yeah,
can
follow
add
up.
to Alvin's point about gifts. One of the teachings is the gift of children to family. And because no one knows what gift that child brings into this world, whether it's a gift of the mind and the intellect, the ability to speak, the ability and gift to hear, to feel, to heal, to create. It is why the entire community comes to obligate themselves to support the parents and the family, to nurture that child as a collective contribution in nurturing the mind and the heart of those children. Because no one knows what gifts they carry, other than to know, as the elders teach, everyone comes into this world not empty, but with some gift. And it is our collective responsibility to nurture that child until the gift rises and appears, and it becomes a self-defining manner in how that reflects, and it becomes epitomized by their passion. And that is really the whole kind of recognition that it takes an entire village to raise a child for those reasons. That when we are able to collectively nurture the mind and the hearts of our children, we are actively engaging in nurturing the mind and the heart to define what kind of caretakers they eventually become. And when we're successful, that all leads to all of the essential core values, which then is epitomized or exemplified in giving of yourself to others and defining what it means to be in the service of others as an essential core value for the maintenance and the vitality and the spirit of the well-being of community. Yeah.
And I like how you just asked the question, what does it mean to be a good parent, right? What would leadership look like if that was the focus in this world, in this, American politics, and really international politics too? that notion is really embedded in a lot of our cultural values and traditions that we do. We talk about na'imbi'e, right? Our kids, our children, the decisions we make, how that's going to impact them too. And so with that, I want to open it up to what you all think are some of the most critical issues facing tribal sovereignty today. If you can talk about examples or what you see are some of those issues. Whoever wants to go first.
For me, and I think at the very heart of why we exist as a leadership institute is really to reflect upon this long history of the way in which colonization at the beginning has really progressed into the purposeful conceptualization of policies and laws like the first unveiling of the Indian education policy 150 years ago that created boarding schools, built on the mantra that the way you kill language and the way you kill culture is to remove the children, essential for the maintenance and vitality of the living spirit of sovereignty and the right to exist, to then deny those children their language and the culture. So in our Leadership Institute, we have developed a process of, one, reflecting on the history that is a forced replication of systems and institutions epitomized by the replication of a governance system with 3 branches of government versus the theocratic nature of traditional governance system where there is no separation of church and state, and the ingenious way in which the attempt by colonizers was to usurp and diminish the role of language and culture and a way of life, to merge Catholicism with Pueblo way of life to create something that doesn't exist in other parts of the world, creating theocracies that fundamentally is the non-separation of church and state, because embedded in that is the guidance of the core values that both gentlemen have reflected upon. So education, in one sense, becomes the biggest threat because it is, one, a process of the continuance of the underpinning of assimilation. And now that we are where we are in 2024, those waves of conscious, one, articulated conceptualization of policies and laws attacking language to kill one of the most precious gifts of the Creator that sustains and nourishes and nurtures the spirit of sovereignty is at the most fragile state in our history, in our lives. And if you remember my statement, the prophetic teachings of our elders is that, one, we have to live life reflective of the hard lessons learned historically to prevent, and those are the prophetic, at the heart of prophetic teachings, is to become aware and fearful of the otherwise inevitableness of those intended policies and laws. And if we do not do anything differently to redefine education at this state, then in our time, at this time, we are contributing to our own demise, allowing Western models of education where language and culture has no place, no value, to, one, contribute to the death of language and culture, and to feel and to realize that on our time, in this time, would be one of the most terrible reflections of future generations upon us in this time, and in their thinking and words will be If only our ancestors did not succumb, might we still have language and culture and a way of life. But if we are successful in redefining education as efforts are today, the hope and prayers are that future generations will reflect upon this time to honor us and appreciate that we did all that was possible to define their inheritance. So replication of systems culminates in the death of all of the gifts of the Creator. And the further we deviate from the core values, if that is the deepest expression of our love for what the Creator gifted us, is when we create our own internal fragileness by our vulnerabilities we create by deviating from the core values. So in my mind, there is an internal, external kind of interplay that we always are challenged. As you talk about the policies of NAGPRA, about the return of sacred patrimony of our ancestors, it is both an internal, external fight. Service becomes essentially no longer internally focused, but education becomes the means by which we are able to contribute in the maximum ways to maintain the spirit internally, while at the same time being able to deal, as these two gentlemen reflect in beautiful, profound ways, the fight and the challenges that is at every level external to our communities that threaten the very survival. And there is a difference in survival that our elders teach us. When language and culture die, it is the beginning of survival. Different fundamentally from the spirit of living. If all is retained as prescribed in our life journey, as gifted by the Creator through the Creator's breath in all that we do.
You want to add anything to Regis? It's always a hard act to follow. I could just acknowledge that, but yeah.
I guess the only thing that I would add is, and this really came, was brought up in our own community conversations during the pandemic, is this reflection of who we are in this time. And the breakdown that we are experiencing in family and community that really needs attention. So education is a significant component of how we, or the lack of access to education, quality education, and also traditional teachings. The fact that that does not, they're not intersecting, they are not as present as they should be, that we are at a very rapid rate in Acoma losing language, core values, that then cause this breakdown within families and community. There's a term that we live by also in Acoma called Utsatukai, which is just really at the core of our daily lives. Being respectful is really the key component there. And when we lose respect in all ways, then we are just so vulnerable. And this is one of those, I think, components that, or elements that might cause us to retain the strength of our sovereignty. And perhaps it's happening in other tribal communities throughout the country and other indigenous communities. We know it happens in mainstream society. Even the nuclear family, from that Western kind of concept, seems fragile and fractured. And when we think of how family is so important to Pueblo people and Pueblo culture and our continuance, we have to do all that we can to protect that core, to protect the family, that we are living, in fact, living, that we are living respectfully. And one of my messaging during my term as governor to our elders and the men especially, the uncles who have this, the maternal uncles who have this responsibility, is to do your job. Fulfill your role as nawai, that's the term, the elder family member. Do your job. If you are not fulfilling that responsibility, someone else then has to step in. Other factors come into play, and we always want to avoid that. So this is one of those pieces for me that has been very much on my mind, and certainly it became more evident when I was governor. And of course, language loss is just such a critical piece in this time. And our communities are doing all that they can, I think, and there's some really great models out there of how to really revitalize language and culture. And I'm really, really thankful for that. And one last point, Dr. Martinez, is that on the positive, not everything is grim, right? I mean, we're happy and we're thriving communities, and when we all come together as a community and feast and ceremony, family occasions, celebrations, it is just a beautiful moment. And when we see the fruits of education, and I wish I had been more in tune to all of this when I was first appointed, because during that first appointment, I realized that, wow, there are these incredible Pueblo people and Native people in our country who are shaping the future. If I knew the Dave Warrens of that time and had relationships with them earlier, Herman Aguayo, Joe Sando, Joe Garcia, and thankfully Regis was always around, but others, and the women, the first PhD at Acoma was a woman, Velma Garcia Mason. Those scholars, those resources, that wealth of resources that already existed and who exist today, many of you are sitting in the audience. That's the positive of all this, is that we're not going anywhere. But we have a little bit of work to do, and having people around, like the gentleman here, all of you, some of you in the audience, really it gives me hope and faith that we'll be okay. We'll be around for a very long time.
Alvin, you want to share some of your insights when it comes to some of the critical issues facing?
As he looks at his phone. I
And then
actually,
we'll open up for questions
I
after
actually
this, so.
think we should open up for
Okay.
questions. Yeah.
Absolutely. Marita has a microphone that, so this is being recorded, so we want to make sure that everybody speaks into the microphone so it's captured accordingly. So if you have questions for any of the panelists on what we talked about or other insights you want to share, raise your hand, Marita can swoop in.
Hi, thank you. Thank you. Yes, that's good. So I have a question about building unity between different pueblos for young people. And my context for that is that I teach social studies at Pojoaque Valley High School, and so I'm surrounded by students from different pueblos every day. And I noticed there's sort of a discriminatory tone when they talk about the different pueblos. And how can you all, or what sort of strategies do you have for that? I mean, some of the things they say are just awful. You know, those people from that pueblo, they're basically white people. Or, no, I'm not going to go out with that person because they're from that other pueblo. And I thought, wow. And then what's worse than that? Well, you can either be white or Mexican. So, you know, how can, I mean, they're teenagers, true, but, you know, there's some sort of like unity sort of thing you guys have thought about or have witnessed in your own work?
I'll take the first part, and then I bet Regis has something to say about this. So I think about this more from one of the hats I wear is I'm a trustee for the Santa Fe Indian School. And we have not only students from all of the 19 pueblos, but from tribes outside, Navajo Nation, Apaches, and also from outside. I think one thing that's really important to keep in mind is I think there's always been a certain amount of healthy rivalry among pueblos. There's definitely extremes to that I think are true in any kind of society among any groups of people. So a certain amount of that sort of pride that we take in our own communities is to be expected. What you're hearing is maybe beyond that, right? And what I find fascinating, because my youngest daughter is a student at the Santa Fe Indian School, and she has friends from many different pueblos. And I think there's a flip side to that. I think when presented with the opportunity, young people from different tribes get an opportunity to actually maybe find out something that they might have heard or assumed about another pueblo is not necessarily true. It may even cause them to reflect on what they've learned and what they see and what their experiences are. So I think part of it is experiences like that, is having a place like the Santa Fe Indian School that puts young people from our different communities together. And you know, in a sense, so even I'll go further, even though you're asking about among different pueblos. Well, I think we have a pretty abundant set of prejudices and ignorance playing out in our country about people from different cities and people from different regions and different states and all the other kinds of things. And my daughter participated in Close Up recently, went to Washington, D.C., and there were, you know, students from Michigan and from Hawaii and from Puerto Rico. She was adopted by the Hawaiians. They thought that she was one of them. They're like, you look like us, you sound like us, we're going to just take you home. She was very happy. She would have gone with them. But I think these are the kinds of experiences we need, because unfortunately, and I could blame social media or a variety of things, we have, I think, a lot of forces at work in our society that perpetuate and exacerbate ignorance. And I think we adults in particular need to be intentional about what kinds of experiences do we provide for young people to interrupt some of those. And so I don't know, Regis, if you want to add things about what the Institute has done.
So it might be age-appropriate behavior? And at the school, we have two, what they call Native American liaisons. They sort of rein everybody in a little bit, plus our Tewa teacher.
I don't know if I would want to ascribe it to age. I think, you know, I think young people at all ages can surprise us by what they're, you know, able to learn.
So in our Leadership Institute, you know, one of the things that we work on is the intentional creation to push back on some of the things that includes your very question. And the way that we do that is we've created outside of education systems by creating a summer policy academy that brings young people from public schools, from charter schools, from parochial schools, from private schools, to really create an opportunity for intentionally creating an environment, one, to become engaged about this history of replication. And this one example of Governor Vallo's point about the core value of respect, one of the elements in our course speaks to the issue with regard to the full effect of replicating systems, right? So core values, one, if we are guided by them, has central in restoring relationships to healthy relationships. When we replicate judicial systems that criminalizes everything in that process, there's no place or value for restorative justice. So that drives us further away from the core values that reduces the value of restorative justice as a way to bring people back into good standing, not just as individuals, but entire families for the purpose, for the maintenance, the health of the entire community. So these are the kind of lessons that are part of our Summer Policy Academy that's now in its 18th year. And it's a very purposeful creation of an environment that while we're providing for rigor, in this case, learning about this history, not taught in other schools, public schools where 90% of our children are enrolled, but we also are teaching core values in this process for young people to appreciate this kind of intentionality that is about socializing, to push back on the kind of attitudes and behaviors that what Elvin shared become another attack on the maintenance of core values from external sources that is very, very intense, that creates and defines attitudes and behaviors. So a lot of what is necessary, to Brian and Elvin's point, is how we are cognizant of these effects and how we respond intentionally in creating, as I said, new spaces and places for the transfer of indigenous knowledge and values in ways that strengthens the maintenance and consistency to behaving driven by and guided by core values. Thank you. Great question.
I saw another hand. Gordon, couple, actually a couple of, oh, yeah, there you go, you're
Yeah,
fast.
I,
So go ahead, just
Is
speak
it
into the
on?
mic.
okay, sorry. So I was hearing him, and I would say too, and sorry, I'm a little nervous, yeah, that we have all had different levels and been affected in different ways by colonialism. And internalized colonialism is rotten. And it does detract from who we are supposed to be. And so with all the things that we are dealing with now and in northern New Mexico and our safety and people, you know, wanting to, because you see me and I'm güera, so I'm mixed. So part of my inheritance is people who want to celebrate fiestas, but they're too much into the cruelty. And then that comes circling and causes us harm. But part of our terms are all relatives and caring for each other. So when we say land back, it's not just to be caretakers, but to have all people well. And so with restorative justice, how can we make our people safe and bring these other people who don't understand into the circle so that we can be well and safe. And we have solidarity. I mean, we push solidarity now. Please.
Regis, I know you were very instrumental in facilitating those conversations with the La Entrada, right, in Santa Fe, city of Santa Fe, tribal leaders and bringing community members to really have these hard conversations. And so there was a shift, right? So maybe you just want to highlight some of.
Thank you for that. It's a really tough issue because it has multiple challenges. But I'll say honestly and frankly that the very cause of that is what education has denied us in the truth of not just indigenous or Hispanic or black history. All of that is our shared history. But education has done all of us a disservice with regard to the inaccuracy and truth about that history. And so as our elders teach us about lived experiences and the hard lessons learned, if that is not part of our consciousness, that education that teaches the truth about our shared history, we would not be in this place with false truths that result in this kind of conflict. In places like New Mexico, I say that in the end, we're all the children of the communion, of the cultural communion, as I referred to it, that represents many people in that shared history. And so unless we are pushing back of what that false history has created in current contemporary conflict, then that kind of conflict and confrontation is perpetuated in public. And so part of the effort in putting an end to the Entrada that celebrates colonialism in the worst possible way, when I met with the Archbishop representing the church, the Fiesta Council, the City Council, the Caballeros, the sponsors of Santa Fe Fiesta and the Entrada, I each went and met with them separately. And part of what I asked them to do was to define their core values, right? And so when we finally were in the process of addressing the conflict and the confrontation and the threats of violence, when people were deviating from their defined core values that otherwise is a beautiful convergence of our shared values, I would just simply say to the church, is that part of your defined core value? Or to the other, is that part of your defined core value, as a way to bring everybody back to the same point of a shared vision? And if the celebration is about a shared faith, none of these kinds of celebrations that celebrate atrocities of the worst representation of colonialism that is necessary for all of us to heal will never happen. And as long as commemorations or celebrations are made of those who symbolize the worst kind of oppression in the days of colonization of this area, then that creates for a conscious celebration of the worst atrocities and inflictions upon people, all people. So core values, again, in my mind, is central to how we bring people back to a shared set of core values that in all discussions, when you reach back to that, it's really amazing how a simple approach can resolve the complexity that human beings create. So it's a process that goes well beyond what I shared in the beginning with regard to core values and its place in the maintenance of the spirit of sovereignty. I hope that answers the question, but it's one that defines my approaches to resolve and negotiate our way out together to a place of common values shared.
Great. Another question over here.
Yeah. Is there a formal mechanism for all the pueblos to work together on governance issues?
Thank you for the question. Yes, there is. There is what is called the All Pueblo Council of Governors, which is the consortium of the 19 pueblos in New Mexico, as well as the Isleta del Sur Pueblo in Texas, in El Paso, Texas. And this body has, when was it founded?
Well, I think what many people would recognize is probably the Pueblo Revolt would be the lead up to the Pueblo Revolt. And then it is recognized by some historians as having been revived in the 1920s when there was the threat of a congressional legislation that would have stripped most of the Pueblos of significant areas of land. And then it has been sort of operational as an organization in one form or another since then.
Right. Thank you, Elvin. So this entity is quite, it's recognized by the federal government, by the Congress, and other governments. And it's one of the longstanding, I would say, consortium of Pueblo leadership that exists in this country. And so the APCG deals with all issues. And they are designed to advocate on behalf of these issues for all of the tribes or all of the pueblos. So they're a strong mechanism. And, I think that, as they continue to grow also, it is staffed, but they are growing the organization to include more Pueblo individuals, professionals, attorneys, lobbyists, and others who advise the staff and work directly with the tribal leaders in formulating legislation, testimonials before the Congress, and then also working on more local issues that are of concern to the consortium of Pueblos.
A question in the back.
Hi, Dr. Warren, you sort of joked that you're all men, and we noticed. So I wondered, are there women being invited to serve in tribal leadership? Could you talk about that?
And before you answer that question, I would like to say I totally recognize that there are all men here, and I really respect all of these gentlemen. But stay tuned for a women's panel in that regard. So please go ahead.
I think it's great that several of us have thought about this, and Marita, thank you for that. I think that's very appropriate. So I'm happy to start because, and this is in part related to the fact that Santa Clara has the unique structure that I've already made reference to. This is kind of a very interesting year for us. As I mentioned, we have 6 elected positions, and this is the first year that 2 women were elected to 2 of the 6 positions. So it's the first time, it's not necessarily the first time that 2 women have sat in the council chambers as leaders, but it's the first time that our community has elected 2 women. What I find also fascinating is our community, the demographics are majority women. So, but I think it would take actually an entirely different session for us to talk about how gender and leadership roles plays out in our communities. It is highly complex, and it is something that is very unique to each community, and I would say it is, well, at least in my community, it is something that is undergoing transformation and a process by which we're having to reconcile a lot of things. And I will say, I have 2 daughters and I have a son. And some of this gets to, excuse me, some of the most fundamental core values that we have about roles and responsibilities. And I mentioned that the role of women as mothers is central to our community. And I would say that is an inherent part of our governance system. And it is one reason why there has not been a history of women in leadership roles, in these kinds of formal leadership roles. Because in one sense, by one interpretation, they are too valuable to be in these roles. It's important to point out that these roles of governors and so forth, in part arose in interaction with the Spanish as the external points of contact, who very much were exposed to danger. And I can say that there are categories of individuals in our community who are not, for whom elected leadership is not appropriate because they are too important to be put at risk in that sense. The other thing that I'll say about our forms of leadership is to be in a leadership position in our community means to be invited into conflict, because there's a part of leadership that is externally perceived, and it's the policies and interacting with other governmental leaders. There's an entirely different part of it that has to do with navigating the intricacies of relationships within our community, and particularly when there are things that come up. Could be conflicts over land, it could be inheritance, it could be a variety of things. And in a society that tries to maintain a certain amount of harmony and balance, to be in leadership means to be invited into disharmony and imbalance, and inevitably to have to make choices or be perceived as making choices that may favor one person or one family over another. In other words, and again, remember, our communities never forget. So if you did something as governor or lieutenant governor, you will be reminded of that for the remainder of your life, and probably your children will be reminded of that. So let's, and I want to be careful with this because I'm very proud to see women serving in our leadership roles. But I want to caution any of us who might automatically be critical of others, communities that may not, for which that may not be currently afforded to women. And I think it's important for us to acknowledge, and I will say this as a Pueblo person, it is not for me to question another Pueblo's decisions about who should be their leaders. I will never know, and I will never understand the intricacies around that decision-making process and its implications for their society. So I hope that helps to answer your question.
You know, I think a fundamental part of this circumstance, on one hand, is dictated by rights framed within a constitution, right, that's imposed. Outside of the secular traditional governance system, you know, there is the common misconception that there are no women leaders. But outside of the secular leadership positions, across the entire spectrum, out of the public eyes and view, women have significant leadership roles in the multitude of societies that internally contribute to the collective maintenance in the spirit of this right to exist with the breath of the life of sovereignty. So the critical roles internal to that maintenance, women have significant roles all across the spectrum out of the view of the public in the most intricate parts of the maintenance of society and Pueblo way of life.
And it really speaks to the structure of governments, those that have constitutions versus other tribes that go by traditional appointments. So tribes that have constitutions tend to vote in women in leadership and on their council. So we can point to Nambe, Powake, Zuni, Isleta, Laguna. So there's that mechanism in place that's very structured very differently than other traditional governments. So again, that's Government 101, which is an entire lifelong to learn about, but just thinking about what's in place as a mechanism also impacts leadership. Marita, there's
I want to ask, one thing that hasn't been mentioned is the cane that tribal governors were given by President Lincoln, and that symbolized that government-to-government relationship. So I think that needs to be mentioned, and that also needs to be taught to our children in school, because that needs to be understood by our youngsters, to understand that is very important for their future, to understand how important that is. And the next thing is, for the first time in history, we have a cabinet secretary for the Department of Interior who is a Native American woman, Deb Holland, from my tribe. So how what advice would you give to tribal leaders, more specifically our governors, to use that, to take advantage of that, I guess, to bring things to the people to benefit both our people with education, with services, or whatever it is?
Thank you, Mr. Saraceno, for that question. Yes, the canes are a very significant symbol of leadership within our Pueblo communities. And it doesn't begin with the Lincoln cane. These staffs of authority are also gifts of the Creator. They existed far before the Spanish canes and the Lincoln cane came to be. They are truly a symbol of our sovereignty and of the people, and our connection to this hierarchy of, not hierarchy, but spiritual forces that protect our people and our lands and resources. In my community, the women are the caretakers of the canes. We're a matriarchal society, and so the mothers of the home, or the clan mothers, are really the decision makers, and they take very seriously the role of caring for those canes. Because I'm not married, don't have a wife, my mother is my niece, my sister. I only have one niece, my sister's daughter. So she's the mother of the home. She's going to turn 10 on May 2nd. And I just would say that the role of the women is critical in tribal governance. Both the secular, on the secular side, and this other form now that we now have. I hope that when we think about the roles of women in our community, that we don't forget the significance of their role in the cultural, on the cultural side. As Regis indicated, there are so many women who have such a great responsibility to care for our way of life. And we all participate in nurturing that and supporting them and providing for them. That's a great responsibility that we have as men to the women in our community. And I'm so grateful that, in community and in my family as well, you know, we've maintained this. It's still strong. So I just wanted to say that about the canes, and I didn't mention the canes, but there's an image that I like to share. I think Regis has seen it before, of my little niece at the time when first year I was appointed as a governor, and she would always come to me if the canes went outside the house and they come back, she would be the one to receive them. And she's sitting on the chair holding the canes on Governor's Feast Day. And she just sat there and talked to them and told the governor, represented as the cane, just rest on my lap. And she was holding them, and I thought that was one of that gave me every strength that I needed to continue the year as governor of my community.
So in the transfer of authority annually, what gets transferred is the canes from Spain, recognizing internationally the sovereignty of pueblos in this case, the linking cane, the cane gifted by the state, the traditional ones that existed long before the others. So in the transfer is an entire bundle that Brian speaks of. One of the most beautiful images during COVID that just, when I saw that image, just the emotion just was overwhelming. And that image was his decision, along with the other leaders, to take the symbol of this spirit to the people, to give them a sense of security that they were being protected beyond the power of human beings greater than us. Was this image when you were fully clothed with the garb during COVID, masked, and you had taken the canes to the people. I believe there was a Head Start bus that was your transport. But this image just overwhelmed me emotionally because the elder people were just outstretched with their hands, reaching for the blessings and protection of the powerful representation and symbolism of this spirit. To me, that was one of the most powerful, beautiful images that spoke about the resilience and the perseverance, all coming and converging with the power of prayer and faith. It was just incredibly moving when I first saw that image.
Was there, oh, you're gonna
I
add
was
to that?
going to answer the second part about
Oh, okay.
Secretary
Go-
Holland, but
go for
we
it.
can skip if there's somebody else. Do you want me to
Go
say
ahead.
something?
I think it's important.
So first, I appreciate you mentioning her, and I think it's very appropriate to point out a couple people in the audience. They're going to be mad at them that I'm going to embarrass them, but I know her as Tweety, but Alita Paisano Suazo. I don't ever say your full name, so I got that out. And then Ann Baruden were instrumental to Deb being appointed. Longtime friends and supporters and political allies, seasoned political professionals. Because it's important to point out something. This begins with Deb. She's an extraordinary person, absolutely extraordinary. Incredibly humble. I remember the very first time that I really interacted with her. I was Secretary of Indian Affairs, and she had hosted or organized a campaign event. Can't remember which campaign. She worked so many campaigns in Laguna, and I went with my family, and there was like 6 people there, including her mom, and she was so apologetic. She said, "I'm sorry, we advertised it. I'm sorry, there's not more people here." And I said, "That's great, more food for me." But I always remember that because she's our Secretary of Interior, and she was the one hanging the posters and making the food and just utterly ready and in service of her community, and has navigated a path that no other Native person has ever navigated, much less any Native woman, to be elected to Congress. Well, we can go through all the things, the chair of the Democratic Party, to be elected to Congress. And the pathway to being appointed secretary, there was a big group of us that had little parts to play in that. Totally fraught. And I would say a lot of people thought it wasn't going to happen. And up until the moment it happened, even those closest of us closest to it, we're not entirely sure it could happen. Because there's so many obstacles that you have to imagine for an individual to overcome. To be appointed as a cabinet secretary at the national level, much less a Native person and a Native woman. And one of the proudest things that I can say is you would think it would have been a slam dunk that Pueblo governors would have immediately backed her. Well, that wasn't the case. And there were certainly other times in her political experience where that support wasn't there. And I am grateful and proud of the Pueblo leaders that we had at the time, that they saw the right thing to do. And they recognized the incredible potential of her serving in this role for all of us. That through the All Pueblo Council of Governors, through the 8 Northern Indian Pueblos Council, to the one, Pueblos stood by her and supported her at the time when it mattered most. And I would say that support, among others, was instrumental to her being appointed to that position. But your question also gets to another point, which I think is appropriate for this context, which is about the exercise of sovereignty. Because, and even the way that Dr. Martinez phrased the question to former Governor Bayo, which is 100 years ago, we were not citizens of this country. When my father was born, he did not have the right to vote. My grandfather was among the many that fought for the rights of Native people to vote in our state, and there was incredible opposition. The prospect of Native people participating in elections, running for office, being elected to office, was almost unheard of, and is very much now an expression of our sovereignty. When Regis, who has engaged in our legislative process longer than anybody I know, the difference it makes to have Native people serving in our Senate and in our House, serving in appointed positions, and one of these days being the governor of our state, makes a fundamental difference to the exercise of sovereignty. And so, but what we have to not forget is the balancing act inherent in that. And I'm not intending to speak for Secretary Holland, but I will say the little that I've glimpsed of that role, it's extremely difficult. Because what tribal leaders might want to believe is, well, now I have somebody who will do anything I ask. It doesn't work like that. She has a responsibility that none of us who unless we've sat in that role, we won't know the balancing act inherent. And so what I can do is say she has elevated Native people in ways within the Department of Interior more than we have ever seen. And she still has the same complex dynamics to navigate. That there are certain folks, some of them are career employees of that department, who don't share her same perspective about tribal rights. And just because she's secretary doesn't necessarily mean every single thing is going to play out the way that every tribal leader would want. And part of what we all collectively need to do is realize, well, that's the reality she's functioning within. So what can we do to help her so that she has the ability to do the things that we're asking of her without assuming, oh, just because she's there, she can do everything we want. It's a complex new reality. It's a good problem to have. I'm glad we have it. But we are just beginning to figure out what it's like when Native people get into these kinds of elected positions.
It's very like when Barack Obama became the first black president. And we all thought this was a defining moment. It was on some level, but the pushback that became the larger reality was tremendous, still is right now. For the first indigenous Native American woman, similarly, to Alvin's point, has not made things easier because there are many who push back principally because she happens to represent the truth of an untold history. And if you have seen and witnessed how vicious some members of Congress have been to her, driven by the agenda to publicly make her, for the public to perceive to be incompetent by the way that they aggressively question her, that no other person is subject to that kind of viciousness that is purely politically driven. So to do some things that we expect her to do becomes a very creative, strategic way to insulate her from the kind of pushback simply on the merits of the politics that is the reality. And that's really a harsh way to respond, but that is the reality. And for her to be the first is a very complicated situation, but the courage and the strength that she has to move forward, to speak the truth. You know this in all of the work that you have done, that it's so central to the honoring of our ancestors, for one, honoring the life and the spirit of sacred patrimony. You've seen this firsthand, but that is the unfortunate reality that she's not immune from.
And thinking about education as a vehicle, the museum is a place for that. One, because she gifted her dress to HNA Here, Now, and Always. So you can see that on display as a teaching tool. So many, K-12 students come and visit that daily. Marita's really good about working with schools to talk about her role and her place. There's a book in the gift shop on Deb Holland that's also published. It's a young adult book that I co-wrote, so be sure, just shameless plug on that. So there's a lot of tools to talk about education for this one figure as a springboard for what's next, right? So these are places and spaces to really elevate these levels of community engagement and education. So.
Are you talking about that white wedding gown looking dress?
It's
No, I'm
close.
just kidding.
but-
I'm just kidding.
Okay, on that note, we're going to be wrapping up. We have one more question.
Well, before I ask my question, I just want to thank this extraordinary moment here with these wonderful leaders and all of your intelligence and your experience, because, and this wraps into my question, because for me, and I'll speak for a lot of others, what we know about the Pueblo people and the Pueblo culture is through the arts. And so I'm very involved in the arts, and I know the artists, and I know like Virgil Ortiz is from Cochiti and things like that. And so I'm wondering, what role do the artists play in your government? Not just the artists, but excuse me, the creative people, the creative entrepreneurs. How are you using them to address and what Brian said about the problems and the families, and how are you using them to build up so that the things continue the way they should.
Thank you, Joanne. Good to see you. Some of the ways that I'm seeing the artist community really come forward is, and it isn't anything new. I mean, the arts in our communities, or the artistry is part of our culture, right? Even while some of us don't have a word for art, I'm always questioning my dad about, words and things. And he used a word one day that I said, "What the heck did you say? I've never heard that word." And he explained how someone was very creative or innovative. Is the word that he used. And I said, "Oh my gosh, I've never heard that." Anyway, so one of the things that if you look at our communities, right, they're very vibrant, just in our architecture, the artistry, the clothes, the traditional clothing that we wear, our signage, the buildings, the homes, the exteriors and the interiors. And a lot of that is attributed to just the creative spirit that lives within us. It's one of those gifts of the Creator. And, in some of our communities, and certainly at Acoma, that is so critical. This concept of beauty, right? Things that are attractive to us are really essential to the way in which we then practice culture. And so when we were developing the Sky City Cultural Center and Agua Museum at Acoma, I had the opportunity to also lead that project. And it was a great time to really explore some ideas with artists around governance, health and wellness, education, and other issues that basically opened the door up for them. And so what are your thoughts? Some of you have traveled the world to show your art, to share your pottery. Some of you are scholars. You've studied the arts. Many are products of IAIA in Santa Fe. But in what ways the question was posed to them, similar to what you just posed to us. What can you do? What can you contribute? What can the arts do to help our community? And in this case, how can the arts play a more central role in the development of this new facility, but more importantly, in the programming? And programming with the community, but also with the public. And it was just like their own creative spirit that comes through in the art that they produce, their ideas were also very, very creative and so different. So one of the things that happened as a result of that exercise was that we then developed a process for the integration of arts in community planning. And thinking of ways to ensure that the arts, but also the artists, and most importantly the artists, would be engaged in planning, would be engaged in think tanks that we organize locally, because it's just a whole different energy and way of thinking about things that I'm really grateful have had influence in decision-making processes at Acoma, where design of buildings and facilities are concerned, but also how arts can be healing. During COVID, the artists were very vulnerable because many of them did not have an income. And they were one of the first groups that we identified to provide some financial support to. And in turn, without asking, many of them came and asked, how can we help? We want to volunteer. We would like to do different things within the community. So that spirit of creativity is such an essential part of who we are. And I don't think that we recognize that early on. It took the pandemic for us to end the loss of our cultural center to a fire, and then to rebuild that facility and engage those artists and to listen to them. It took those tragic events for us to then really find a way to bring them into the mix. And as you know, they do a lot of educating in the public with collectors, with museums. They are at the tables during consultation sometimes. They are presenting bodies of work that are now accessible to the public, not only in the United States, but beyond. Sharing a little bit about our history and culture, but also addressing contemporary issues and bringing them to the forefront through their art to the public at large. And so that creates an awareness, which is so important, that we might not otherwise have the opportunity to share if it had not been for some of our artists who are willing to spend that time outside of their communities and homes and away from their art to do that education.
You know, art is another form of language, of communication, of our people and our ways. And if any of you have ever had the privilege of the opportunity, the honor to witness what is public in terms of ceremony, but for those of us coming from the community who are witnesses to the most intimate parts of ceremony, there is where art is in full display in the most beautiful and wondrous ways that evokes the relationships of the symbolism to the spirit world and the human and physical world. It is the greatest gift of expression for what is represented and symbolized, what they evoke spiritually. And that's an incredible blessing, that artist and that gift that they're given with which to create perpetuates the innermost parts of who we are as a people and our culture in their own gifted ways.
What a great note to end on, to really wrap. Thank you for your question, Joanne. Thank you, Brian and Regis and Alvin. It's always an honor to share space and talk among you all and to share you all with the public too. So thank you, Marita. I see Danielle and Elizabeth in the back too. Thank you to MIAC for the work that you do to host these forums. I hate to be the person between us and the food, right? So Marita's going to plug in the next event.
Yes, thank you so much for this panel today. I really respect all of you. Thank you so much. Good day, Waha. Our next panel will be